invitation and for you stepping in to help me with all this. So really, thank you. I'm very much appreciative of that. I'm very glad to be back at NUS again, second time in a week, which is great for me, and also to engage with this audience in person as well as online. Hello, everybody online. I understand we have quite a few people there too, and it's really quite enjoyable to be in the midst of audiences again, to be able to see people in person and to engage with them in person. You know, doing things online is great. It gives you access to audiences that you wouldn't otherwise have, but there's really nothing that is the same as engaging with people in person. So I'm very glad for that opportunity. And of course, being in Singapore, a country that I've been coming to now for 15 years, it's always wonderful to be back the first time after COVID. And I keep on wanting to come back and wanting to stay for more time each time that I'm here. And I've had a very nice trip, been warmly welcomed, and I'm very touched by that. And I'm sorry that it has to end, but at some point I suppose these things do have to end. And it just means that I have to come back again very, very soon, I hope. There's something that's very obviously poignant with regards to Singapore and the subject of today. Today's not really a book launch. I know that that was the impression that we gave, but really it was an excuse for me to talk about different themes that I thought were very interesting with regards to Singapore, or rather things that I hope you will find interesting so that we can engage about it. I don't intend to speak for very long, but I wanted to bring up a few themes that I thought were interesting for this audience. Okay, so Shaykh Seraj Hendricks, God rest his soul, he was part of the Cape Malay, community, in that the vast majority of the Muslim minority in the western part of South Africa, they generally find their roots in the Malay took place. Malay not meaning Malaysia, Malaysia, Nusantara, more generally speaking, people like Sheikh Yusuf Makassar and others, Tonguru, these are all very significant figures, and they're really what starts the creation of a community in South Africa of Muslims. And during the early period of that history, which of course happens under colonialism, they're really cut off from the rest of the Islamic world, and everywhere else. It's the slavery period, isn't it? And then in between the slavery period and the apartheid period is not very long at all. And it's a very interesting development. And, you see some of those developments in how they engage even in religious practice, where, they'll have celebrations for the birth of the Prophet, and their tunes will date back to that period under slavery, which are very interesting, and also impacts from other parts of Africa as well. You have a very interesting historical reality where a lot of the slaves that went to South Africa, other slaves went to Latin America or South America, more generally speaking, but you don't see an extant Muslim community in South America from that period. They essentially became, they died out, as it were. And people wonder why, since they came from, both similar sorts of backgrounds, why this was the case. And historians tell me it was because the slaves that came to South Africa, they were scholars and they were Sufi sheikhs, and they passed on their religious tradition through these practices. And as a result of passing those on, they managed to maintain their sense of religious identity and religious tradition in ways that other places simply didn't have the opportunity to do. Now, obviously, that connection between Southeast Asia and South Africa, it pretty much, stays suspended, for a long period of time. And I'll get to where it stops pretty soon. But, one thing that happens post-slavery, pre-apartheid, is a man called Mohammed Saleh Hendricks leaving Cape Town and going off to study Islam and religious sciences in Mecca, which at the time was still under the Ottomans. okay? And he starts a new tradition. And what I mean by that is that you have him studying with the family of what are called the Maliki family, okay, which are originally from Morocco but settled in Mecca generations before. And then he goes back. He stays in Mecca for about 12 years, I think it was, or 15 years, and then he comes back. And you then see him found this particular institution for the teaching of the religious sciences and as well. And then he has 4 sons that then go back to Mecca and they study of the Maliki scholar that he studied with. One of them dies in Mecca, 3 of them come back. They continue that tradition in Cape Town. And then 2 of their nephews go back to Mecca and they study with the grandson of the man that Muhammad Saleh studied with in Mecca. So it's really 3 generations of interrelationships between the Hendricks family and the Maliki family. And that remains very, very strong to this day. And now there's a 4th generation that is continuing that tradition, although not in Mecca. So it's a very interesting historical reality. Now, the Muslim minority in South Africa, I found fascinating. You know, I first did a book on Muslim minorities back in 2008, which was on Muslim minorities of Europe. And they obviously have all their own challenges and they're different. And, you know, it's difficult to talk of a Muslim European community when there's so many different nation states, of course, and, you know, it's a very disparate set of communities. One thing that I found fascinating about South Africa was that it was so incredibly integral to the wider society. Part of this has to do with apartheid, because you had all of these Muslim figures involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. So when it finally succeeds, they're also brought in to the mainstream in that way, which is also very interesting, because then you don't have these questions around, you know, identity or integration or all this sort of stuff. You know, they're just part and parcel of the surrounding community, and at the same time, deeply, deeply, deeply connected to their religious traditions, which are expressed in song and of course religious practice and commitments to various parts of the Islamic heritage. But it's very indigenous in that regard. And that was also something that I found really interesting. That was a theme that, you know, I wanted to explore with all of you here today, because of course there are always these questions about, okay, how can Islam in the contemporary age look like? You know, what are these answers to pluralism or to living in multiracial or multi-religious societies? And, you know, at least in Cape Town, nobody even seemed to really think about it. They just lived it, and it all seemed very, very much, you know, intact. There were other issues about race, but that had to do with the apartheid, and that had to do with the remnants of, or the repercussions of, years and years of apartheid, in terms of the rebalancing of wealth and things like that. And, you know, you had that discussion with the ANC, the African National Congress, but it wasn't a religious issue. You know, it wasn't a religious issue, and I found that very interesting. And I'm sure there are lessons or, you know, insights that people might give from a Singaporean context as well. So that's all I have to say about all of this right now. And you'll see that purposely I didn't want to speak for too long, so I really want to engage with all of you. And that's really the excuse. Really, the event was an excuse that I get to engage with this particular audience, and that I get to listen to people who are very insightful, including most definitely my co-panelists. And I thank both of them for agreeing to be here this evening and to share their thoughts with us. So thank you.
So I think now we will have Dr. Suzaina. Would you like to speak now?
Sure.
Or would you like Fazlur to do it first?
I think Fazlur will talk a bit more specifically to the Muslim community in Singapore.
Okay.
But I think talk more generally
To Southeast Asia.
which is really, I mean, of course I'm a Singaporean Muslim, but my work off and on has really been about the Muslim community. So in Indonesia, the question of indigenization has come up, I think in the last, maybe in the last 20 years, when there's been a question around the threats to an indigenous sort of understanding of how Islam is practiced, right? And that's around the big debate of what many of us will think about when we hear about Arabization. So it's still very much a big debate now in Indonesia about the extent of Arabization, to what extent that's really threatening the indigenous, I suppose, the indigenous sort of practices of Islam. Whereas if you compare it to the earlier approaches to Islam, the view is that sort of this because it's a majority community, the indigenous sort of mixing of Islamic practice and understanding together with localized tradition is kind of very much part of the Indonesian landscape, right? And that's something that when we discuss Indonesia, it's often brought up as, I suppose, the pride, the sort of answer to moderation within the region, tolerance, and so on and so forth. My own view is actually, obviously, that's a simplification, because the idea around indigenization is a lot more complex than indigenization being integral or able to adapt very much to localized society, and therefore not threaten and destabilize both within the country but also within the region. My own view is that that's actually a simplification in our understanding of what indigenization means for Indonesia. And so therefore it's when we look deeper, it's not a linear trajectory in which indigenization means an ability to integrate and therefore moderate. The reality is that we would look very carefully, it can go either way. So there are ways in which it can go either way. But the debate around Arabization more recently is quite interesting. The emergence of new movements, in which the argument goes, has been sort of the arrival of a certain perspective of Arab whatever the next understanding of Islam and Arab culture into Indonesia is further destabilizing it, and that's where you get the discussions around radicalization, fundamental. And to me, that's also a simplification, obviously, because I think we can easily question what Arabization means. And at any point when the ideas flow, there's always an action-reaction. And in the process, almost inevitably, there's an evolution. And even within areas where, at least in my experience, where we are dealing with much more an Arab perspective, or however we may want to describe that, and a much more fundamentalist orientation within Indonesia, at the local, when you go in, it's far more complex in how it's never again linear. So it's never simply the ideas arrive, people embrace, and therefore you try to spread it, and then it goes in one direction. But in fact, it often leads to action and reaction. Right? So I found subsequently, when I was looking at more sort of Islamist kind of thinking within Indonesia and how it arrives into the local communities, that in fact it does lead to a period in which there's further reaction. And then even in those kind of thinking, it gets to an indigenization. So you'll see that some of these movements are further evolving, such that their take or their perspective on the practice changes. And in some ways, however we want to define it, gets further indigenized. But it's an evolution in localized practice. And of course, there are many other forces that impact that. So I think both the whole argument around there being an indigenous understanding of what Islam is like in Indonesia, for example, Islam Nusantara, versus a much more Arabized version, is way too simplistic, because I think the Arabized version leads to articulation, right? I guess I can come to further examples if we want for that. But I guess fundamentally I wanted to highlight that it's never a linear direction. And that the process is actually quite complicated from the front. And maybe we can have a discussion with everybody here. So I'll pass it on to Fazlur to talk more specifically about minorities.
Thank you. Thank you. Fazlur.
Michelle, Dr. Hisham, Dr. Suzaina. As you can see, these are extreme academics. As for myself, I'm a layman on the ground. I think what Dr. Hisham has shared in terms of where the Cape Malays as a minority in South African context, and you hear from Dr. Suzaina looking at how in Indonesia, although it's a majority Muslim, but how some of the influence of Arabization, in fact, recently Nahdlatul Ulama celebrated its 100 years. And we have Muhammadiyah there, and now we have this trend of Arabization and the context where the Muslims are majority in Indonesia. But let me take back from Dr. Hisham's book on the minorities. And being involved here in Singapore, I just have 3 points which we can very open for discussion. The first one is that I think for some of you may be aware that I was actually living in Qatar 2008, 2015 with a family working there. And interestingly, when we were there, our Singapore community, we have a car decal of Singapore and Qatari flag. Because sometimes we go on convoy, we just want to ensure that we don't get lost. So interestingly, when some of the Qataris or Arabs sit in my car, and then they say, Fazlur, Singapore flag, we have 5 stars. I says, yeah, Arkanul Islam. I says, no way, you're not an Islamic state. You are just minority Muslims. I says, yeah, I mean, normally Muslim countries, 1 crescent moon and 1 star. We have 5 stars. But what do the 5 stars stand for? Peace, equality, justice, progress, democracy. I say, and these Islamic values. And then we have some people who say, we have traveled to Middle East, we find Muslim, but we don't find Islam. But when we travel to Japan, we don't find Muslim, but we find Islam. So what does this state? And this is also open for discussion in terms of even for us Muslims, as Singaporean Muslims in Singapore, how do we feel vis-a-vis even the recent incident of our 18-year-old Irfan, who want to create an Islamic state? So, because there are some claims and some narrative, even for some of Singaporeans who say, oh, we must have a Muslim leadership, we must have, Islamic Sharia law, and that was happening now in Indonesia, and a bit more we hear in Malaysia. So, does it mean we are not better off Muslims as minorities under a non-Muslim government? So that's something for us to discuss. And then sometimes we wonder, you want an Islamic state, but how about the state of Islam in ourselves, where we can be a good Muslim wherever we are? Interesting, last Saturday, we had a closed door dialogue with the madrasa students. Arresting also because of the arrest. And it's good to hear from the madrasa students. And in fact, I asked that question, how do you feel? Are you as good Muslims in Singapore as minority as compared to some of them who think that we should be a majority Muslim countries? And then I was heartened that the response was, yes, we feel that we can have good Muslims in Singapore because the mujahada, the strife, the struggle that we have to put in will be more as what will be in the West. Because even when we were in Qatar, Shaykh, I think you know that call for prayer, you can easily pray. But in Singapore, we have to find a corner, we have to find a place. Even Dr. Suzaina, when we were in the US, we had to pray by the staircase to the central library. Right? So, but that becomes our makeshift prayer place. We don't have to have a musalla that we have to call for a musalla that we can pray as a Muslim. Not because the land of Allah is everywhere. It's up to us to adhere to the injunction. That's my first point. The second point is that, as what Michelle mentioned, during those days, I was in the government state board, and then now, when Muiz was embarking on the Waqaf, so I left to join DTZ, an international British firm, as the portfolio advisor for Muiz. And we did some of the innovation. We did Islamic bonds, the sukuk, to finance Bencoolen, how we develop Bencoolen. We bought 11 bistro, and some innovation that the value of Wakaf at that time was, in 2000, was 250 million, and today is close to $1 billion. And then I was invited to present an Islamic finance conference in Dubai, 2002. That actually brought me the first time to Dubai, 2002. And my title of the presentation was Wakaf Rejuvenation, the Singapore's Experience. So after I shared all this, and after my presentation, I have some of the Arabs from Islamic banks and the property development firms come up to me and say, Fazlur, you're from Singapore, you do all this, but you're minority Muslims. You have done all this. I says, yes, but because of circumstances and the context of Singapore, because we are going through urbanization, we own Muslim land, but we have to develop it. I mean, example, for if some of you may be aware that the Wheelock Place in Orchard, it was formerly an Angolia mosque. Those days when I was in RI, we always go there. And because it was acquired for development. So likewise, we as a Muslim community, we have to respond. And I will say after that, notwithstanding myself as a minority Muslim, I was invited to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei to share. So this to show that as minority Muslims, relating to our own local context, we're able to excel as a community. My third point, it also relates then to the fatwa. And alhamdulillah, just now we had actually Mufti was here earlier on with Shaykh Hisham. For some of us, we recall 2 weeks ago, during our Friday sermon, we had the khutbah which touched on the fatwa. The fatwa explains well that it may differ according to context and time. Still relating to the text from the Quran and Hadith, but how do you relate that into Singapore? And that's why it's important for Singapore Muslims to understand that notwithstanding we are a minority, we have Muiz, we have Office of Mufti, and we have a good Mufti that would respect the text and relate it to our Singapore's context, given that we are a minority Muslim within a secular state, even sometimes when I share a secular state with a soul, because you're able to practice a religion with freedom, but do not condemn on any other religion, because that's where the law will come after you. So even again on that fatwa, just to share that, remember the last Eid al-Fitr? There was a bit of commotion because Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei celebrated 1 day earlier because they said they saw the moon. But our Mufti says, no, we didn't see the moon. And there was some commotion because Singapore Muslims say, hey, we should respect the majority Muslim countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, they're Muslim countries. We are minority. So why are we not following them? And then I myself had to respond, and then there was an Al Jazeera article which shows from astronomy perspective, the moon was never sighted. And that's why you remember South Asia, our part of the world, they don't see the moon. I mean, we respect the decision by our neighboring countries, but our Mufti was right. And that's why what's important as minority Muslims, we have to have trust and we need to support the Mufti as Singaporean Muslims within our context of Singapore. I'll leave it at this and then we can open for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I found that quite interesting. I mean, for me, I would say there's a few takeaways. One is that as a minority, clearly navigating is not that easy. And, you know, as Dr. Suzaina has pointed out, it's never linear, you know, and it can go in any direction, you know, and I think this is a reality that any minority would face with any religion, any faith, right? I'd like to open up the floor now to our audience to see if there are questions that you would like to ask of any of the speakers, or perhaps you have thoughts that you'd like to challenge some of the thinking that has come up. I think Sharon's just coming now to take the microphone off me. So just put your hand up.
Sure, sorry.
So thank you very much for your interventions and your points. I found them very interesting. There was one thing in particular, Dr. Saina, that you mentioned, which was about this issue of quote unquote indigenization in Indonesia and Arabization, right? Which, and I'm glad that you said it's not always linear, because of course the roots of how Islam entered that part of the world were by Arabs, right? And they were Hadramis. And it's interesting to see that, you know, the most traditional of the religious establishment in Indonesia, they're of course Nahdlatul Ulama, right? Which highly and deeply respects their Arab origins in terms of that history, but they're very much about, you know, the local context and local tradition and so on and so forth. I found that very interesting because it shows, again, it's not linear, right? You know, so they're not disrespecting their origins, and it brought to mind something once that, you know, some of the stuff can get very ugly, you know. So I remember being in Kuala Lumpur, you know, some years ago for a conference, and one of my former institutions had brought over a delegation of people to actually, you know, study and engage with Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. It was a Southeast Asian sort of thing. And I remember somebody was giving us all a briefing, and they incorrectly assumed that we were all purely Westerners. Of course, I am a Westerner, but I'm also an Arab. And it was a very bizarre sort of moment where the local brief was trying very hard to convince us that they, as you know, Nusantara Muslims, were good Muslims, like those bad Muslims in the Arab world. They sort of forgot that I was Hindu, half English, but it was an interesting phenomenon, right? Of this idea of trying to present to external actors that, you know, we're not like those Arabs over there, you know, it's like pluralistic types, right? And that, of course, brings up other questions about, you know, authenticity, but then also these problematic sort of discourses, right? Within different regions. It was something interesting that I noted, and especially at the same time as you mentioned, that, you know, these communities they didn't just come out of nowhere, right? Like everybody comes from somewhere at some point or another, and there's a lot of interchange. And so, you know, somebody was mentioning to me the other day that you'll find a lot of cultural influences in the south of Yemen that are actually from Southeast Asia, because people went and then they came back and they brought stuff with them. So there can be that sort of thing going on. I thought I'd just, you know, mention that to people. But indeed, we do have any questions, including from online, Sean, if there are any, please, you know, we're all here to have this discussion.
So we wait for questions. I actually had a question for you, and it's just quite interesting that you brought up the story, because so this is a comment, and then I'll get to the question. So my experience in Indonesia has also been quite interesting. Obviously, you know, when I started studying Indonesia, I was studying Nahdlatul Ulama and very immersed in the movement and looking at this whole how it gets indigenized and how it's not, again, a linear process, and how it's a constant evolution. So that's Nahdlatul Ulama. But in more recent times, I've traveled outside of Java to areas which are not NU dominated, but to which they identify themselves as indigenous sort of Muslim communities. They don't necessarily ascribe to Nahdlatul Ulama. There are, in parts of Indonesia, well-established Arab communities who are very proud of their Arab and their understanding of Islam. And it's just very interesting in terms of how they identify me as I move, right? Because I'm from Arab. So it's always interesting when they'll ask the question of whether, okay, so you're Singaporean, you're coming, you know, you're Arab, right?
You have to move the mic because your voice is not.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah. So and then so there's a external perception in which you are identified, and and how that then puts a certain status, right? So it's good versus bad, or above versus not, and it's quite interesting in how complex a dynamic that is, because Indonesia is so large, and it's really about there are these communities outside of Java itself, in how they identify themselves and how they practice, and how they see themselves as indigenizing, right? And then my question really is that I've talked about it's non-linear, there's this evolution in how the ideas spread, and you describe, right, as you do in the book, about how these ideas are being taught and learned and spread, right? So we've got, I have not read the book, but what I'm hearing is that you've got these communities moving from Mecca to South Africa. My question is really about whether we are seeing now, with social media and the internet, a form and a way in which ideas are spreading, to which there is no filter, and there's a learning process which is not lost, and to which then indigenization is producing a certain entity, or almost something we are looking at that's quite distinct and different from how ideas and practices spread in the way you described earlier, right? So that's my question, whether with internet and with technological advancements, we are looking at something different.
That's an excellent question, and one that in various ways has actually come up multiple times on my trip to Singapore and also to Malaysia. I've been on the road now literally for 3 weeks, and I'm looking forward to a holiday. As enjoyable as this has been. Before I answer your question, I did have a question, which was, you mentioned these communities that they self-identify as indigenous Muslim communities in Indonesia. But as you rightly note, it's a majority Muslim society. So when they say indigenous, and I think you intimated they're not part of, they're not under, let's say, the rubric of Nahdlatul Ulama. So what do they mean when they say they're indigenous communities?
So a lot of it is, it's, I haven't explored it. It's just my interactions with them.
It seems that they are operating outside of Java. So these are smaller groups of populations in the islands, which, they're the smaller islands in Indonesia that maybe in which Islam would have arrived in the same way that it would have arrived in Aceh, but our focus has been so much on Java and how Islam spread throughout Java that we often, well, certainly I forget these communities, right? So they identify themselves as separate from Java. So a lot of it is territorial, almost regional, right?
Is this practice different?
There are localized practices, which are pretty different, quite specific to the ethnic community. Yeah.
So in response to thank you for that, I was curious, because obviously Indonesia is, how many hundreds of islands, and subcultures as well. So that's all very interesting to keep in mind. And of course, traditionally, as you look at how these communities have developed in places like China or in South Africa or whatever, that they take on, local cultural affinities and particularities that are quite fascinating. They're very often shown, and I remember this in South Africa, they're quite often shown in art and song, particularly when it comes to the celebrations that take place during the month of the birth of the Prophet. And you see that very clearly. Now, in response to your question, I think that's a really interesting observation, because social media has really turned a lot of things on its head. And I think we don't actually recognize how significant and substantial this is, not simply for the discussion that you were talking about, but just generally in terms of, frankly, life. I really deeply believe that the speed at which ideas can be thrown across borders, again without filter, but then also the effect that this has on new generations, the effect that it has on young people. You'd never see these quote unquote online influencers, they would be out of a job, and quite rightly so, frankly, because the very nature of social media isn't that it gets more likes or shares or retweets or whatever, because the information is actually good or authentic or well informed, or it's about being sensationalistic. That's all it is. Whether you like it or you don't like it. And if you don't like it, you still share it. As you attack it, you're still sharing. So it still gets out, right? Whereas, of course, this wouldn't have been possible before. And I think that has a tremendous impact, because in that learning experience, so if I think about, those three generations, and now there's the fourth, of going back and forth from quote unquote, the margins, okay, to the center, there's a long and arduous process that gets involved, isn't there? It's a long trip, but then also when they're there, they're engaging with people, their living experiences, and they won't be able to get the knowledge or the information that they're looking for, except that they go through those experiences, and that, inculcates certain types of pedagogies, certain types of training, and so on. And again, the tradition that I mentioned with regards to Cape Town, it's a tradition of learning. It is a tradition of scholarship, but we're also talking about spiritual traditions. And you can't do that on the internet, as much as people might think otherwise. But the limitations, but also the speed that gets involved when you talk about this. I mean, I talk about this in other arenas with regards to radicalization and extremism, and the mainstreaming of the far right. All of this is indelibly, connected to the spread of social media in this sort of way. You couldn't imagine, a Donald Trump presidency pre-social media. It just is not possible. Okay. Or Brexit, or all sorts of things like that. It's very much connected to it. And I don't think we take that really into account, how much that has really changed the discourse.
Okay, I've got two questions here that have come from our Zoom audience. Yes, I'm apparently now the conveyor of these messages to you. I'm going to hear both the questions, and then you can answer them one after the other. Okay, so the first question has come from Anita M. And she has asked this question: how do you see minority groups operating going forward in countries which are showing a backslide in democratic values? I thought that's quite interesting. The second question has come from Fadil, and I'm wondering if this is the Fadil who used to work with us at MEI, but it's a good question as well. It is a question for you, Hisham. To what extent should this discussion surrounding indigenization include considerations of the interaction between Islamic law and culture/custom? Good questions.
And they're quite, they're also, they cut across a lot of borders. So when we're talking, if I'm correct, the first question is talking of minorities where you have the far right.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I've been talking about this for the last few weeks on this trip, because I've been talking about minority groups in places like Malaysia and Singapore, as in I've been doing talks on this after my own research, and I come out this from a particular perspective, just personally. And what I mean by that is that in some places I'm a minority, in other places I'm a majority, and in some places I'm both at the same time. So I'm half English, so that puts me into quote unquote the majority camp when it comes to the UK, but I'm also mixed race, so that's different. When I'm in the Arab world, because of my sensitivities or my empathy towards minority experiences, I take that pretty seriously. When I see minority groups within the Arab world and the wider Middle East and what's happened in different cases there too. So I find the current trend of the far right to be very concerning, and I find it very concerning for two reasons. And I think we touched on this, Michelle, last week, if I'm not mistaken. My last 3 weeks are a bit of a blur, but I think this did come up, where the mainstreaming of the far right means that discourses that were exclusively part and parcel of the propaganda or the political programs of far-right movements are now no longer just about those political parties. In fact, those political parties might be marginal and remain marginal, but their discourses have become mainstream, so it doesn't actually matter. And in some, so that's one aspect, or that's one scenario that takes place where the parties remain marginal, but their concerns and their quote unquote solutions become the same as the center, which is very concerning, because of the sort of things that they say. And in other places, it's not even just that, it's also the mainstreaming of those parties. And, you see that across Europe. And you see that even within the Middle East. This has come up a couple of times on this trip as well, where the far right in Israel has become mainstream, and is now and not just simply in terms of discourse, but actually the political parties themselves have moved into the center. They're a government. But when we think about the far right in the West, which I think is what your questioner was getting at. The Republican Party in the United States has shifted to the far right quite a lot. MAGA is nothing if not a far right movement. Okay. You see that in other parts of Europe. Unfortunately, countries that have good history, have actually very strong histories about pushing back against certain types of things, and I'm hopeful that they will do so again. But it's very unfortunate that in the meantime, there's all this discourse around refugees and migrants, and a lot of it is focused on Muslims, because there's this very interesting, historical development of, actually this covers everything. If we go after Muslims, then it covers everything. It covers migrants, it covers people of color, it covers a religion we don't like, it covers everything, and it becomes a real rallying cry in order to again get votes. Somebody asked me once about, and don't you think terrorism is the reason for anti-Muslim bigotry or Islamophobia? I said, well, look at the data. The data shows that actually when terrorist attacks take place, that's not when Islamophobia jumps up. Islamophobia jumps up around election time. Islamophobia jumps up around election time. So it is very much a vote getter. In many of these places, it very much is a vote getter. And I'm not really sure what people are doing in regards to that. I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, Austria elected a coalition government. There was a particularly odious gentleman who was from the Freedom Party. He became chancellor as part of the deal, etc. And the European Union responded by essentially sanctioning Austria. Okay, it was very serious. Fast forward to 2023, and Viktor Orban is fine. Much worse, but there you go, and that's the way that it is. Okay, so, and you see a lot of center-right parties in the European Union that are espousing a lot of discourse that's really quite odious, but is no longer on the margins, and we cannot claim is on the margins, and it would be silly to do so because it would underestimate the intensity of that conversation. And I think that's also true in large parts of the Republican Party in the United States as well. And you've seen that in other places, of course, but I think your question was talking more about the far right in the West. Now, with regards to your second question about Islamic law and culture, historically speaking, I think it's just very much the reality that you see these communities arise in different cultural contexts, and they just take on, different quote-unquote colors of the place. I was in Malaysia, last week or so, and I was given a tour of quote-unquote a Chinese mosque. Okay, I say quote-unquote because it's very new, but they're really old Chinese mosques that we see in China that are more than 1,000 years old, and they look completely different. And you see that, of course, in Singapore and Malaysia, that these are really part and parcel of local architecture and art and so on. And then you have these Arabization attempts, which are very funny because they don't work, and they literally don't work. So, you know, as you all know, there's a lot of rain. It's part of the point, and a lot of rain. Anyway, and you know, what are you going to do with houses in climates that have a lot of rain? You're going to make sure the roofs are like that, aren't you? You're going to make sure that the rain gets filtered off, aren't you? So what happens to, you know, this poor guy who decides, well, I've been to the Arab world, and that's where Islam is really from, isn't it? And in Saudi, their mosques are built like this. So he comes back and he builds a mosque like that. And of course, the roof falls in because it collects all the rain, right? So it literally doesn't work. But these things are new, you know. So, I mean, the questioner, I mean, I'm getting from the question that this is, quote unquote, a new challenge. And I don't think it is. I think that you have a lot of evidence to show that, you know, these communities are all really different from each other. You know, Nigerian Muslims don't look like Malaysian Muslims in terms of their dress. They will in terms of their practice. So, you know, religion doesn't change, or rather, you know, the ritual practices, they don't necessarily get impacted by that. But there are lots of other things that do and always have. And I think that that's something very interesting about those communities. And I remember seeing, oh no, I didn't see it. I was with a professor from the American University in Cairo. He was English and he was telling about how he went on the Hajj. And he said, you know, I went and I did my Hajj and I thought I'm going to, after the Hajj is done, because after the Hajj is done, everybody then changes out of their Hajj garb, right, which is pure white. And they just go around in their own sort of national dresses, don't they, for Eid and so on, well, you know, for different things thereafter. And he got a thobe, he got an Arab sort of one length shirt, and he went down and he just saw all of this color. He just saw all this you know, this wave of different types of dresses. So he went back upstairs and put on a tweed suit and came back down. Because he's like, well, if they do, then why don't I? You know, and I think that's just very organically what takes place in these communities, at least from what I've seen.
You just see if there's anybody who you have to see.
Just a couple of quick questions. The first would be, my name is Farouk from Wales. My first question would be, what are the key ingredients for the process of indigenization to sort of operate sustainably? In which, for example, in the short term, it is responding to a particular phenomenon, like such as Arabization. But in the long run, it's not just responding or merely responding, but it is transforming and producing new bodies of knowledge. That's my first question. My second question would be, in our efforts to indigenize, what are some of the discursive constraints in terms of in which we sort of avoid falling into nativism, right? Where we sort of cut ourselves from the civilizational aspects of Islam. So that's my questions. Thank you.
That's really great to hear those sorts of questions. First, I'd say, because I know you're talking about your own experience, right? As a Singaporean, I don't think you guys need to indigenize. I think you are indigenous, and I recognize as such. Sort of mistake. So I don't think that's really too much of an issue for you here. But I like very much that you asked about this whole, you know, it's not just a reactive thing in certain cases, it's a proactive one. And, you know, there's something called cultural capital, right? And cultural capital, I think, is something that communities, particularly those who are demographically minorities, become majorities. And I don't mean majorities in terms of becoming demographically as such, but are no longer thinking in minority mindsets, if that's a phrase that I can use. Rather, they feel as though and are recognized as such by the majority as being part of the majority. Like, I never got the impression when I was in South Africa, particularly in Cape Town at least, that they were a minority. Now, of course, demographically, of course, they're minorities. It would be ridiculous to think about it. But they never expressed themselves as having quote unquote minority concerns. So they were always talking about, wider concerns. Now, of course, they also talked about their own particular needs that are about them as a minority group. But they were also talking about majority ones, in the sense that the mainstream has these concerns about good governance, accountability, justice, all of that sort of thing. And again, like the South African community was also involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. Okay, as a minority group, maybe they didn't need to do that. Okay, but they felt very strong, at least those who were active, of course, felt very strongly about that. So it's that sort of thing that I think is just very important. When it comes to discourse and, the restraints or the limitations, if, again, I don't know if this applies to you, but, and I would presume it does in most ways, but when I think about other minority communities that don't have a very long history in those particular places, and here I'm thinking mostly about Western Europe and North America. Okay, they're much newer. They're not new, but they're much newer. Okay, so you have Muslim communities in Central, Northern, and Southeastern Europe that go back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, so that's separate. Okay, when you talk about Western Europe, not really. Okay, Western Europe, the quote unquote Muslim presence is relatively new, 50, 60, 70 years old, but in terms of significant numbers. So they're building culture, now it's a mix, okay, because obviously they originate from migrations, and the migrations are from different places, and there's a smattering of converts as well, smattering in the sense of, just proportions, right? And they're not going anywhere, and they're not thinking about quote unquote return. They wouldn't return. There's nowhere to return to. They were born and raised in these countries, and I've seen these discourses develop over the past 20 years through my research, where people start talking about, again, cultural capital and cultural production. The most successful of them that remain, because you're talking about a sustainable effort, something that can continue and stay alive. The most sustainable ones have been those projects that don't try to deny their connection to the sort of broader tradition of their religious faith, but try to do something fresh, rooted within it. Okay, so one example is a colleague and friend and teacher, TJ Winter at the University of Cambridge. He comes up with, these hymns. Okay, they're actually hymns, but they're odes to the prophets, and they sound like church hymns. They really do, and on purpose. Okay, and of course they're in English, but they're also trying to draw on that heritage, which is very much English or Scottish or Welsh, because they thought, this is what people need. They need to create, new cultural modes that will work. Now, I have to say, the last time, I brought this up, actually we did a panel just like this at Cambridge a few months ago. And one of the things that he admitted was that, he did this sort of work for a long time, and it's not that he stopped, but that he started to feel that actually, maybe even a wider challenge is that culture itself is being pulverized. Okay, and what he meant by that is that partly due to social media, there is a hegemonization of culture, a globalized culture, which tries to flatten everything. And it would be enough work just to hold on to like the old stuff, okay? Because it's just all getting sort of pushed out, which I found very interesting because he did a lot of work on stuff like that. I find it interesting that he was focusing on that so much. I don't know if that addresses all of
Yes.
what you're trying. Okay, good.
Any other questions?
My name is Asif Shuja. I'm from Middle East Institute. Uh, uh, I just heard what Ms. Fazlur has said. More than establishing an Islamic state, it's important to think about the state of Islam in our mind. Uh, I think that's worth considering by the scholars, the state of Islam in our mind. But leading to that, I have a question for Dr. Hellyer. See, Islam is actually a thing for us to be practiced, throughout our life, every second. But there's always a conflict between the proper understanding of Islam, what is right, what is wrong. And I think that conflict actually creates a space for these powers, whether it is Imam or Wilayat Faqih or Islamic leader or head of the Islamic State. So how do we reconcile as Muslims this dichotomy, this conflict, not knowing what is Islamic, but still we have to practice it each and every second? This is a question for you. Thank you.
That's a big question. So as you know, I'm sure, and this is just me as the academic speaking here, there is no such thing as a hierarchical, ecclesiastical papist authority in Islam, right? So there's nothing equivalent to the Vatican and the Pope, right? That doesn't mean that there's nothing called religious authority in Islam. And historically, that's just very much the case. There's always been religious authority in Islam, but people look for church-like structures, and it doesn't exist, at least for the vast majority of Muslims. You could argue, maybe you could argue, and I wouldn't, but I suppose there's an argument here that Shia Islam would be different in this regard, but I don't really buy that. I think that what you have is something far more akin to scholastic, academic, peer-reviewed style authority, right? And what I mean by that is that you have circles of scholarly groupings that are not inaccessible, okay, historically speaking, that are not inaccessible. They're not passed down through caste systems or something. They're passed through learning and being recognized as scholars in the same way that in academic peer review, they do the same, at least theoretically speaking. I think that's how traditionally you see the transmission or the continuation of these religious traditions take place. So, for example, we're in Southeast Asia. The school of law that predominates here is the Shafi'i school of law. It's a Sunni right of jurisprudence that traces itself back for more than 1400 years, okay? And at every generation sort of adds and filters or, engages with the current, etc., right? So there's a continuation and there's a transmission that at least is claimed and is accepted, which is why you have all of these people in this part of the world. You're talking hundreds of millions of people who will practice according to that right. Yeah. Same thing when it comes to other rights in other parts of the world. So there's this transmission that takes place on the basis of the recognition of religious authority, but not a papal or not as I said, a hierarchical ecclesiastical authority structure. It's far more akin to sort of peer review. In my opinion, that's the best way to look at it. Some other religious traditionalists do the same. The Jewish community, at least traditionally, has that historically. That's the community of the rabbis and so on. But it's well known, at least in academia, that this is how religious authority has been transmitted for those communities. Again, going back 14 centuries. And I think people still find those credible. Doesn't mean there aren't problems. There are, of course, problems. But somebody and not somebody, this issue around radicalization, extremism, and Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and so on. I remember people talking about this in the early 2000s, not with regards to Islamic State, but other extremist groups. And, you know, I think we've forgotten that this discussion was had. They viewed it as a crisis of religious authority, where people didn't view religious authority in quite the same way. So it was really up for grabs by anybody and everybody. And I think that's where, you know, a lot of these issues really find their roots, in my opinion.
Okay, I'm going to, I want to actually see if either Dr. Suzaina or
Yes.
Fazlur has actually got some comments, questions, or, you know, they disagree with Hisham, you know, and would like to give a view. So I just, no, go ahead.
Mission, you had some questions for me.
You have questions? I
Academic. I'm question professors.
I have a comment, just a reaction, and then a question. Actually, so the question is on your answer to the final question about the religious authority, right? I think you described theoretically what it is, but I wonder whether the emergence of a hierarchical structure
is actually a reflection of the indigenous.
That we see in parts of Southeast Asia, because we know how Islam is understood and practiced, say in parts of Indonesia, how it's understood and recognized by the locals.
There is almost like the imam, right?
And the imam then defines how they are to practice Islam. They don't necessarily question it because their understanding is that the imam's word is almost absolute. And we'll see that in these communities. So I'm wondering whether the emergence of that is in fact a reflection of the indigenization that we are talking about, right? Because you're absolutely right that there is no such structure, and that we may be talking about religious authority, but there's no sort of definitive, this you must follow, that in fact you can think through, reflect, and in fact make changes. That's the reality. But how it's actually understood in the everyday lives of people is quite different. That's my question.
Dr. Hisham, can I just add on to what?
Yes, sure.
I think recently, we've been hearing, a lot been shared on social media. Saudi Arabia is greening. I mean, it's greening again. It's getting green again. Green. Right? Signs of the end.
Oh.
And the recent article, the inner core of the earth has gone counterclockwise, where the hadith says, at the west end of the world, the sun will rise in the west. And then there's now increasing thing to say that, you know, Imam Mahdi, we are waiting for Imam Mahdi, so we have to be unified again under the black flag. So there's a reason now on social media, this kind of calling, that notwithstanding what we've been saying, that we have the local authorities, even in Singapore, we have a mufti, a very good mufti, in fact. But now there's been called that we have to unite under that one leadership is coming, the Khalifa. So how do we then address this kind of narrative? Thank you.
So I'll be honest, I don't take social media that seriously. Because I think it's designed to amplify the most sensationalistic nonsense that's out there, right? So as I've said, there's going to be people that say things that are really stupid. And we will know that they're very stupid, but because we don't like it, we will attack it. And by attacking it and by sort of quoting it or sharing it or so on, we inadvertently amplify it. And so I don't generally sort of take that for granted. I think a lot of people just say silly things in their head, and sometimes they get onto a computer screen. Now, I tell you this as somebody who takes radicalization extremely seriously, and has done for about 20 years. And post 2005, as you know, was involved in in tackling that problem post London bombings. So I'm not one to dismiss that there's an issue, but honestly, people say just dumb things on social media. They really do, and I don't think that they really count for very much. Not those sorts of things anyway. I think people are just they're sort of grabbing at anything that they can say to get people worked up. So I don't really know how much worth there is at spending too much time on engaging with it, to be quite frank. When it comes to the reflection, as you said, of indigenization, I find that interesting because so going back to COVID, okay, and we're still in the pandemic, I know, but going back to COVID, and I was having a discussion actually with the Mufti about this before everybody came. I was comparing communities in places like South Africa, one community that I knew really well, and communities in South Asia, not Southeast Asia, but South Asia, and responses to the calls of, closing places of worship, including the mosques, and stuff like that. And, one community I knew in South Africa, they didn't put up a struggle about it at all. The imam or the sheikh of the community said, time to close, because otherwise people will die. Okay. And they said, thank you very much, we're done. They closed the mosque, and that was that. And then you had another reaction in some parts of South Asia, where the imam or the scholar, whatever, is interpreting the call to close the mosques from the state as an assault on their authority. So actually, they're not thinking about the health implications as much as they're thinking about their own authority. That's a very different sort of thing that goes on. And when I discussed, how religious authority traditionally, at least as we understand historically in academia, in the Islamic world, it's really been about scholarship, right? So anybody who wants to become one of the ulama, you want to go spend that time, and there's a lot of time in order to quote unquote gain access to the syndicate. Be my guest. I mean, it's not sort of blocked off for them. And if it is, and if something that they don't do, then as much as they might, not necessarily take everybody seriously, but they will defer, which I think is kind of natural, to be honest. I mean, if I have a toothache, I'm going to take the opinion of my dentist over my plumber or my architect, right? I mean, I think that a lot of that is natural. I think what's not necessarily as healthy, of course, is when people start to try to impose a type of authority where there's no engagement and no talk and no discussions and so on. But I think that's a separate issue. I think that's more about people trying to impose not just understandings, but their own, again, authority in ways and means that they don't actually have access to, really.
Okay. Yes.
So thank you all for a great discussion. Aisha Al-Sarih here, a research fellow at the Middle East Institute. It's not really my expertise, the Islam and the political Islam, but I am from Oman, and yes, my religion is Islam. So my question is, listening to all of you, does Singapore represent a role model for the indigenization of the Muslim minorities? If so, like why, and if not, why? Thank you.
That's from you guys. Last one,
When people come to my part of the world and try to pontificate when they've only been around for a few days, I'm not, can't do that to all of you. I really like Singapore, and sure you have problems as well as other places. I'm not going to say more than that. And besides, there are people who are genuinely experts on this country that really should talk. So Dr. Suzaina, please.
Okay.
I mean, we were just talking about authority and authenticity of knowledge, and you want me to talk about a country I've spent 5 days in.
So I don't know quite how to answer that question. I don't know whether we should go out there and declare ourselves as like, we are the model. Because firstly, I think that's, I don't know what that, what's that model, right? I do think we are constantly learning to I don't know, operate as Muslims within the Singapore context. I think it's every community has a different context within which they all have to operate in. Whether we have emerged with sort of an indigenized version, that one I don't know. I suppose we can ask people from Muiz and all that, right, about what that means. I actually wanted to respond to a point that you brought up, which really struck me, and maybe that partially answers how, if there's a model and how I see it myself, right? Because I'm a Singaporean Muslim. You talked about this thing of cultural capital, and no longer thinking of yourself as a minority or having minority concerns. And as you said that, I was just thinking, I was just reflecting on my position, right? I don't see myself as a minority. I see myself as Singaporean. I have very real concerns about the future of Singapore. And I think the concerns that I have transcends my religious or ethnic identity. It's actually very national. So I don't know whether that's what you're referring to. But I think it does reflect a space that I'm at in terms of my level of comfort of my own identity, right, as an ethnic and a religious minority, because it doesn't supersede how I'm thinking about the future. There are real concerns I have about the future of Singapore, about the future of the region, about things that are occurring at the global level. And I think that's a reflection of that very comfortable space many of us find ourselves actually in Singapore, that sometimes I think we do take for granted.
Yeah, it's fascinating you put it like that, because as you were talking, I was thinking about other demographic minority communities that I've studied that are not Muslim, actually. So Egyptian Copts, if you ever told them that they're an Egyptian in some way, they'd be very, very unhappy. They're in fact they consider themselves sometimes to be ultra Egyptian, ultras. And Jordanian Christians, okay, they are as Jordanian as everybody else. Now, of course, they have minority concerns in the sense that, oh, well, we need these types of procedures in order to construct churches or whatever, right, which are very natural for people to inquire about. So they're not sort of fading away into the mainstream. They're actually very proud of their distinctive identities, but they don't think of themselves as minorities, and actually they get very annoyed at being described as minorities. And I remember this very clearly, over the past few years, where you'd have evangelical groups in places like the United States and the United Kingdom, and they'd want to talk about these communities as minority communities that they must sort of go and save, okay? And they get very cross and say, actually, when you do that, you're denigrating our status, okay? We're not minorities, even though, I mean, Jordan has quotas, okay? In Egypt, you have separate systems. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that is actually very distinctive, but they don't perceive themselves to be minorities, even though, of course, they know demographically that's what they are. But politically or economically or whatever, that they're not looking to be like that. And they get very cross, actually, when people describe them as otherwise, even though they might be worried about sectarianism and things like that. So that's interesting, but I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I suppose it just bears a testimony to how these communities develop over time, and I'm sure there are lessons to learn from many places.
Maybe if I can just add, well, the minority, I mean, the Singaporean Muslim community, we are actually also finding ourselves. In fact, in MUIS, we have this, Singapore Muslim identity. We are trying to create a minority Muslim community of excellence, of success. In fact, I think MUIS has a program, right? A research program on Muslim community of success. Maybe I can get people MUIS to explain, to share further. Even our own minister, Masagos, have shared that the 3 Cs, character, competency, and citizenry. So in the sense that big minority itself in Singapore, we are able to be progressive, do not feel apologetic that we are Muslims in Singapore. We are rich in our tradition, but we will still continue to excel and then contribute as a gracious, caring society. Because what's important is that we are living in a more cosmopolitan. In fact, the traditional composition of our Muslims, I mean, we have Malays, Indians, the Hanafis, traditionally, and then of course we have some of the Arabs, but we are finding more because of cross-migration. We have Singaporeans moving overseas, we have foreigners, because we are open economy, so we welcome foreigners to Singapore, and then we are finding a more diversified ethnic groups, Muslims. So, and then they bring their own interpretation. But what's important then, once you're in Singapore, if you feel that Singapore is home, and this is where then we need to contextualize living in a secular, inclusive society. I think that's what we are trying to do. So if we want to claim that we can be a model for other countries, definitely no, because we ourselves are trying to find our own footing. And I would say, alhamdulillah, in the sense that I think the years of nation building, in fact, for some of the Muslims are doing more effort now to reach out, to build bridges, to get involved in the bigger society. We are now creating our own identity to show that we are actually part of this Singaporean inclusive society. So it's still work in progress.
Okay. You got a question? I think we'll take this as the last question, and then I will invite our panelists if they've got any last comments. Yeah. So last.
Sorry, my name is Ashraf. I'm studying at the University of Life. I have 2 questions. Firstly is for Dr. Hellyer, and second is for all the panelists. The first question will be, as all of us might have known, history have shown us that Islam, or per se Sufism, has spread, has integrated seamlessly with minority countries. For example, back then in Java, in Patani, with the Wali Songo, as well as the Hadramis that we owe our deen to, and also in South Africa, with the advent of Sheikh Yusuf Makassar. From Dr. Hellyer's perspective, what hallmarks of spirituality that you observe that helps the religion integrate seamlessly into the community or into the culture itself, and how can we apply that to the current context, as well as in the future, where the values of religion as well as culture itself is diminishing? My second question is to all the panelists, because as you have mentioned, the platform of social media itself, where it's unfiltered, it is, in my generation, in the young generations, it's like combating both our minds and also affecting our hearts, because one way or another, whether we like it or not, we are still involved in this ballgame, in this space. We are affected by it directly or indirectly. So how can we immunize ourselves to better understand what is right and filter out what is what Dr. Hellyer mentioned, the ridiculous ones, for example. Yeah. So those are my two questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'll talk about that because you raised a question on
the technological advancements and what we are seeing with the internet. I don't think I certainly don't have the answer about how we create that filter. I don't think we have the option of switching off because it's moving fast, and all the advancements that are happening are just what we are seeing on, so it's moving literally, day by day. They are advancing. So we're dealing with social media at one level. At the next level, for example, at my level, we're dealing with AI and what that's going to be into education. AI is another, it's another ball game, right? Because that means we're going to have computers able to have algorithms, able to process answers, and churn that out, right? We don't need, we don't need the teachers, we don't need the frameworks. And even at the university, we're grappling with that to try and figure out how we can. Ultimately, I still think it's about what's the word? About re-emphasizing the education and the educational framework. It's about being able to think critically, using a methodology. It may mean that we have to go back to what is the traditional methodology in these scholarly communities. That's actually very central to Islam that many of us don't necessarily understand. But I think that there is a methodology that we will have to go back to, because that's where the answer may be, right? So instead of assuming that we get an answer in the future, the answer may be to think through what the frameworks were actually existing previous to that, right? So on education, for example, we are harping on critical thinking now, because we know we can't defeat AI, so to speak. We need to train our young to be able to see critically all this information and ultimately get there. So I think the same is going to apply here in terms of addressing that challenge that you mentioned.
Just a quick response. I think we can't isolate fully proof of self from what's happening in social media. In fact, in terms of some of those ideologies, we have some of those preachers being banned by the government. But the thing is then, they're still very active on social media. So it's up to us as individuals to be able to understand, to sift through. In fact, we receive a lot of all these videos which I shared actually coming from Indonesia, So again, it's been shared. Sometimes my mother will send to me, is it true? I say, I got to be the checker. But what's important too, I think it's because they're out there, I think the narrative, how do we then as a society, I mean, talking about our own Singaporean society, able to respond? So I think this is where we're asking more of those out there, because sometimes those people comment, with that kind of narrative, we call it the tin kosong, the empty vessels. They just want to get attention. But I think what's important is that I always ask, especially the younger ones, because this is where it's your age, even the younger asatiza, to go out there, and because this is where you need to fine-tune the interpretation and the understanding. So, well, there's this engagement, and I think what Dr. Suzaina mentioned, again, we're talking about ChatGPT and these other things. So as Muslims, we go back to our fundamentals, but how then we respond to this in the social media world? I think Dr. Hellyer will have a better explanation.
What a question to end on. So you asked two questions, so I'll address those two questions and then thank the crowd. I think social media is a cesspit. I really do. And it's very ironic because I use it a lot. And I use it a lot for research purposes and my work. And I'm very grateful that I began my academic career when it didn't actually exist. I think my perspectives would have been very, very much different had that not been the case. And I'm glad that I came of age long before this actually was a reality, because again, I think it's really dangerous, you know. And I'm not even talking here about radicalization or extremism, but just the way that it has an effect on people. Seeing how people engage with each other online in ways that they wouldn't have dreamt of engaging with in person, but that then has a knock-on effect. Eventually, they'll start behaving like that in person too. And you know, I say this to people: you always train or you always give advice to your children before you send them to school about how to deal with certain situations, and nobody does that when it comes to social media. You know, we just give our kids screens and we just say, yeah, okay, you know, or we try to limit their time, but we don't actually do more than that. And I think that that's going to have a significant impact on how that generation really looks at the world. So I don't have any easy answers for you when it comes to that. I think people should really be very aware of it, because again, I can't imagine, you know, the mainstreaming of the far right without social media. I think it would have been impossible in that sort of way, or at least taken much longer. You know, but this is the nature of the modern world, right? You know, technology makes things move really fast, and in many ways that's great, as long as you know where you're going. I don't want to be on a train that's going 500 miles per hour if it's headed over a cliff. Okay. In response to your first question, which is regards to Sufism and how that impacted you know, the arrival of Islam in this part of the world. Of course, that's true in many other parts of the world as well, where you had, you know, these traders who were heavily influenced or were, you know, purveyors of spiritual traditions, and that's really what, you know, changed people. You know, I mean, you have to speak to spiritual masters about stuff like that, not somebody like myself. But I think that it's just very clear that, you know, people's hearts get touched by hearts. You know, I think that's just the reality of it. With that, from the bottom of my heart, I would like to thank MEI again for this very invigorating final event of mine. You know, I head off to the airport quite soon, and I've been, you know, really grateful to have had such distinguished people with me on this panel, to listen to everything that you've had to say. I will think about a lot of it. It's given me a lot to consider and contemplate. And to all of you, those of you who are online, as well as, you know, all of the people that we have here, it's again a pleasure to be back in Singapore. I really do hope to be back again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me.